What saves the Ingalls family and the town from starvation, of course, isn't technology, but the raw courage of two young men, relying on their instincts, honor, and a pair of smart, strong horses. So they went on, running, riding, and thumping their chests, then running again, while the horses trotted briskly. "Say, how long do we keep this up?" Cap shouted once, joking. "Till we find wheat, or hell freezes," Almanzo answered. The town is ill-prepared for what's ahead from the very beginning. In the chapter Indian Warning, Wilder again sets up a conflict between the natural world, represented by the very old Indian, and civilization, the men gathered around the counter in Mr. Hawthorne's store. The illustrations in the Garth Williams edition of The Long Winter illustrates this point very clearly. The Indian stands apart from the men gathered at the store. You see all the supplies civilization can furnish through the railroad. Of course, all these supplies will soon be gone, and for the length of the hard winter will be irreplaceable. The Indian himself represents the wisdom of the untamed West. His brown face was scarred in deep wrinkles and shriveled on the bones, but he stood tall and straight. His eyes were bright and sharp. Behind him the sun was shining on the dusty street, and an Indian pony stood there waiting. He delivers his warning, and only Pa exchanges a word with him. When he leaves, the men are confused, unsure of how seriously they should heed his warning. "You suppose the old geezer knows what he's talking about?" Royal wanted to know. No one could answer that. But Pa, because of his inherent affinity with the natural world and the real West, represented by the old Indian, interprets the message very clearly for the men gathered around the counter in the store, and heeds the old Indian's warning. When Pa gets home, he tells Ma and the girls, "We're moving to town as quick as we can. I've got to haul in hay first for the stock. I can haul one load before dark if I hustle." This episode is, of course, based on an event Wilder remembered from her childhood. She wrote about it in Pioneer Girl. To contemporary readers, the scene in both the autobiography and The Long Winter may appear as a dated and patronizing portrayal of an American Indian man. He uses a stereotypical phrase, "heap big snow," to convey his warning, along with an improvised sign language. And in the novel, her description of him with his blanket, bare brown arms, and scalp lock seems more consistent with the Osage men she remembered from her childhood than the Dakota, Lakota, and Nakota men living on nearby reservations in Dakota Territory. Yet Pa's respect for the old American Indian man underscores the wisdom and intelligence he offers white settlers in De Smet. And I think it's significant that, like Big Jerry and By the Shores of Silver Lake, the old Indian man in The Long Winter makes a mythic exit from the story. He walked out of the store to his waiting pony and rode away toward the west. It is interesting to note that an early history of Dakota Territory, published in 1915, just over 30 years after the hard winter, also refers to American Indian perspectives about the winter of 1880-1881. There were intelligent Indians then living at the Yankton Agency in southeastern Dakota Territory who had been born in this upper Missouri Valley 75 and 80 years prior to the event, the first blizzard during the hard winter, who could recall no occurrence of such a wintry visitation during October. Many early historical sources reinforce Wilder's depictions of events in The Long Winter. Kingsbury's history, for example, reports that the first blizzard of October 1880 lasted for 24 hours and that livestock suffered severely, thousands of heads being out on the prairies at that time. He also notes that tens of thousands of range cattle perished, an image that reinforces the scene in The Long Winter when Pa releases the motionless cattle, their heads frozen over with ice and snow. This episode, too, comes directly out of Wilder's autobiography. The historical record also supports Wilder's depiction of The Long Winter itself. Storm after storm of the most damaging and disheartening character was the rule through the next 5 months during the winter of 1880-1881. Trains became snowbound and then eventually stopped running altogether. A surviving fragment from the Kingsbury County News, published in DeSmet on February 24, 1881, reads, "The leading question is, when shall we have a train from the east?" Pioneer historian George Kingsbury also observed that trainloads of fuel were on the tracks bound for Dakota, but snowbound and unable to move, and it was later claimed that some trains thus laden lay for months buried in drifts on side tracks, and that human power was inadequate to move them. Kingsbury adds that the railroad had not yet shipped in the winter supply of coal or other fuel, so that this essential was one of the earliest necessities of life that was discovered to be lacking. In fact, the citizens of DeSmet did turn to twisting hay for fuel. That same fragment from the Kingsbury County News noted on February 24, 1884, that hay fire is all the rage now in town. The long winter moves into its darkest and most hopeless scenes as Laura twists hay or mills the family's dwindling supply of wheat in the coffee grinder. The days are dark and dreary. The family subsists on Ma's sourdough brown bread. Reality for Laura has become something of a nightmare. Winter had lasted so long that it seemed it would never end. It seemed they would never really wake up. In the morning, Laura got out of bed into the cold. She dressed downstairs by the fire that Pa had kindled before he went to the stable. They ate their coarse brown bread. Then all day long, she and Ma and Mary ground wheat and twisted hay as fast as they could. The fire must not go out. It was very cold. They ate some coarse brown bread. Then Laura crawled into the cold bed and shivered until she got warm enough to sleep. Next morning, she got out of bed into the cold, but she did not ever feel awake. She felt beaten by the cold and the storms. She knew she was dull and stupid, but she could not wake up. This dream-like quality pervades the entire book. Think of how often a chapter ends with Laura drifting off to sleep, listening to the wind howl, or worrying about their dwindling supply of food and fuel. Huddled close together and shivering under the covers, they listened to it. Laura thought of the lost and lonely houses, each one alone and blind and cowering in the fury of the storm. There were houses in town, but not even a light from one of them could reach another. And the town was all alone on the frozen, endless prairie, where snow drifted and winds howled, and the whirling blizzard put out the stars in the sun. Laura tried to think of the good brown smell and taste of the beef for dinner tomorrow, but she could not forget that now the houses in the town would be all alone until spring. There was half a bushel of wheat that they could grind to make flour, and there were the few potatoes, but nothing more to eat until the train came. The wheat and the potatoes were not enough. In the earliest chapters of The Long Winter, this dreamy quality seems almost benign. But in the closing chapters, Wilder depicts a waking nightmare world that is numbing, dull, and unsatisfying. In the chapter, Cold and Dark, even Pa's attempts to read from his big green book sends Laura into a waking nightmare. Laura tried to listen, but she felt stupid and numb. Pa's voice slid away into the ceaseless noise of the storm. She felt that the blizzard must stop before she could do anything, before she could even listen or think, but it would never stop. It had been blowing forever. She was tired. She was tired of the cold and the dark, tired of brown bread and potatoes, tired of twisting hay and grinding wheat, filling the stove and washing dishes and making beds and going to sleep and waking up. She was tired of the blizzard winds. There was no tune in them anymore, only confusion of sound beating on her ears. It becomes hard for Laura to distinguish reality from dream because reality has become a nightmare. The trance-like reality through which the fictional Ingalls family moves in the long winter is unique to this book, and it appears to be a deliberate stylistic device, a technique that brings readers closer to the emotional and physical experiences of starvation and freezing to death. A dreamy, trance-like state is a symptom often associated with both. Even after Almanzo and Kat bring back the seed wheat, the fictional Ingalls family struggles with hunger and cold. There was nothing in the world but cold and dark and work and coarse brown bread and winds blowing. The storm was always there, outside the walls, waiting sometimes, then pouncing, shaking the house, roaring, snarling, and screaming in rage. This dreamlike quality, relayed primarily through Laura and Pa, makes The Long Winter such an artistic achievement. It gives the novel its creative and narrative strength and makes the fictional family's experiences more real and tangible. It communicates the feelings of cold and hunger in a credible and compelling way. At the end of The Long Winter, it's clear that Laura isn't a child anymore, that she's a young woman who has survived a harrowing experience and emerged on the other side, stronger, more capable, and yet ever hopeful. Remember that most young adult novels, even those that deal with gritty, difficult, and deadly themes, usually end with a feeling of hope, and that's certainly true of The Long Winter. Although the novel ends with a Christmas celebration in May and Pa's ability to once again play the fiddle, the emotional ending comes a bit earlier in the chapter entitled It Can't Beat Us. Laura wakes up in the middle of the night, and the nightmare blizzard world finally ends. She sprang up in bed and called aloud, "Pa, Pa, the Chinook is blowing." The Chinook was blowing. Spring had come. The blizzard had given up. It was driven back to the north. Blissfully, Laura stretched out in bed. She put both arms on top of the quilts, and they were not very cold. She listened to the blowing wind and dripping eaves, and she knew that in the other room, Pa was lying awake too, listening and glad. The Chinook, the wind of spring, was blowing. Winter had ended.